The call came just as I was setting the kettle on the stove. The shrill ring of the phone startled me, but not nearly as much as the voice that followed. "Your mom blocked my card. I can't even buy a closet." Sophie's voice sliced through the quiet morning like a blade. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "Sophie, what do you mean, dear?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my heart had already started to beat faster. She huffed on the other end, loud and impatient. "Don't act innocent, Elaine. I was at the boutique and my card got declined. The manager said the bank froze it. You must have done something." "I don't even have access to your account," I said, gripping the counter for balance. "Well, you manage the trust, don't you?" she snapped. "That means you control the cards. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was, in front of everyone?" Before I could form another word, the line went dead. I stood there, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, the kettle whistling behind me like an alarm I couldn't turn off. My fingers trembled as I hung up the phone. Sophie had never spoken to me kindly, but this was something new. I turned off the stove, trying to steady my breath. Maybe it was a mistake. Banks make mistakes all the time, don't they? I was reaching for the window to let in some air when the doorbell rang, sharp, insistent, angry. I knew before I opened it. Ethan was on the porch, his jaw tight, eyes blazing in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. The sight made my stomach knot. "Mom," he said, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite him. "What did you do?" I don't understand," I stammered. He tossed his phone onto the table. "Sophie's card, the one tied to the family account, it's blocked. She said you froze it." "I didn't," I said softly. "I wouldn't even know how." He laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Oh, come on, Mom. You've been controlling the finances since Dad passed. You love reminding everyone it's your name on the trust." Those words hit harder than any slap could have. "Ethan, that's not fair," I whispered. "I've only tried to make sure things are managed responsibly, you know that." His tone sharpened. "Responsible? You're treating us like children. We're adults, married adults." Sophie needed that card. "To buy a closet," I interrupted before I could stop myself. The silence that followed was deafening. His eyes darkened. "Don't start judging her again." I was. "Yes, you were," he snapped. "You've been judging her since the day we got engaged. You think she's not good enough for me, don't you?" I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I saw my reflection in his anger, small, tired, outnumbered. He grabbed his phone, his voice rising. "Unbelievable. After everything we've done for you, after we let you move closer, after Sophie helped decorate your house, this is how you thank us." I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes. "Ethan," I said quietly, "I never asked you to do those things." He paused, but only for a moment. Then maybe that was my mistake. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. He turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. For a long time, I just stood there, the echo of his anger still vibrating in my chest. The kettle had gone cold on the stove. Outside, the mail truck rumbled past, ordinary and uncaring. I wanted to believe this was just a misunderstanding, that by tomorrow, everything would be back to normal. But deep down, I already knew better. Something had shifted, and there was no undoing it. I was born and raised in a town so small that everyone knew what kind of pie you baked before Sunday supper. I married young 22 and thought life would always move at the same gentle pace as those early years. My husband, Michael, was a kind man, quiet but steady. He worked at the local manufacturing company and later started his own small firm that made office furniture. He never chased luxury, just stability. Together we built a life out of simple things: morning coffee on the porch, paperbacks stacked beside the bed, laughter echoing down the hallway when Ethan was little. When Michael died an unexpected heart attack at 50, I felt as though someone had switched off the sun. But grief had to share space with responsibility. Ethan was in college then, and I refused to let our loss derail his future. I took extra shifts at the library, cataloging late into the evening, my glasses slipping down my nose. The town's budget was tight, but I didn't mind the work. There was something comforting about rows of books, their spines lined up like soldiers who never betrayed you. Every dollar I earned, I saved, not for myself, but for Ethan. I paid his tuition quietly, without ever letting him feel the strain. When he graduated with honors, I cried so hard I embarrassed him in front of his friends. He used to call me every night back then, telling me about his first job in the city, how excited he was to finally make it. Those calls were my favorite part of the day. I'd sit by the window, tea in hand, picturing the little boy who used to fall asleep with his toy cars beside him. For a while things were simple, then came Sophie. She was beautiful, confident, and sharp-tongued in a way that felt rehearsed. The first time Ethan brought her home, she complimented my cooking and my house in the same sentence that suggested both were outdated. "So quaint," she said, running her fingers along my worn oak table, like something from a vintage catalog. Ethan laughed. I smiled, though something inside me sank. Still, I tried. I told myself love makes people nervous. She wanted to fit in, that was all. I bought her a scarf for Christmas, silk, expensive, and she thanked me with a distracted smile before checking her phone. Ethan noticed nothing. He was too busy watching her every move, as though she held the world's approval in her hands. When they married, I felt both proud and uneasy. The ceremony was lavish: white orchids, champagne towers, a live quartet. I remember standing near the back, wearing my best blue dress, feeling out of place among all that glitter. Sophie's parents owned several boutiques. Money flowed easily in their world. Mine had always been measured, careful. Michael had left behind a trust fund, his way of ensuring I'd never struggle. I'd managed it conservatively, drawing only what I needed for bills and donations to the local library. I never saw it as wealth, only as security. When Ethan asked if he could link one of his cards to the family account for emergencies, I agreed without hesitation. He was my son, I trusted him. At first it was small purchases, a few dinners, some travel expenses. Then came luxury furniture, designer clothing, trips to places I couldn't pronounce. The statements surprised me, but Ethan always had explanations. "Bonuses are delayed," he'd say. "We'll pay it back next month." I believed him because that's what mothers do. We believe long after evidence tells us not to. I told myself Sophie would mellow with time, that she'd see value in ordinary kindness. But she never did. When I visited their apartment one afternoon, she greeted me in a robe that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Ethan's at work," she said, motioning toward a crystal decanter. "Can I get you something stronger than tea?" I declined, sitting on a couch so white I was afraid to touch it. "You've made it lovely here," I offered. She smiled thinly. "It's a start. Ethan says once the trust fully opens up, we'll move into something bigger, maybe with a view." The words lodged like stones in my chest. "The trust isn't meant for extravagance," I said gently. "It's there for security for the future." Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Security means different things to different people, Elaine." That was the moment I realized we spoke entirely different languages. Mine was built on gratitude, hers on entitlement. Still, I tried to hold on to what remained between my son and me. He would visit occasionally, bring flowers, ask about my health, but every conversation circled back to Sophie's projects, her plans, her needs. He had started measuring success in her vocabulary, not his own. I never told him how lonely it felt, watching him drift further into her orbit. How strange it was to see the boy who once collected bottle caps now discussing yacht rentals. I just kept managing the trust, balancing numbers that no longer represented shared dreams but expectations. When Sophie's call came that morning, angry, shrill, accusing, it wasn't just about a credit card. It was about years of silent erosion, the quiet shift from love to obligation. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after Ethan left, staring at the folder that held all the trust documents. My name on the signature lines suddenly felt less like protection and more like a target. I had always believed that money tested people differently. Some saw it as comfort, others as control. I wasn't sure yet which one my son had chosen. But I was about to find out. It's strange how peace often looks perfect right before it breaks. The Sunday before everything fell apart had been one of those afternoons that almost fooled me into believing we were a normal, happy family again. The sun poured softly through the lace curtains of my dining room, dusting the table in a glow that made even my old china look new. I'd set the table early that morning: roast chicken, rosemary potatoes, the apple pie Ethan always loved since childhood. The same recipe his father used to request every birthday. It felt good to cook again, to fill the house with smells that used to mean comfort. When the doorbell rang, I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it to see Ethan grinning, Sophie at his side. She wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky, a white dress that seemed far too crisp for a Sunday meal at her mother-in-law. Yet she smiled, even kissed my cheek. "Smells divine," she said, stepping in with a breeze of perfume that carried something expensive and distant. Ethan followed, his arm resting protectively around her shoulders. "You didn't have to go all out, Mom," he said, glancing at the spread. "I wanted to," I told him, and I meant it. Cooking for them made me feel useful again, anchored to something real. For a few hours at least, we could pretend nothing was fractured between us. Lunch began with laughter, small stories, and the clinking of forks on china. Sophie complimented my cooking several times, each one sounding just a bit too polished as though she were performing graciousness. But I took it anyway. Mothers learn to take what they can get. At one point, Ethan reached for a second helping of potatoes and said, "You still remember the recipe, huh?" "How could I forget?" I smiled. "It was your father's favorite too." That mention of Michael changed the air slightly. Sophie set down her fork, her eyes flicking to Ethan. "Speaking of your dad," she said, "I've been going over the trust statements with the administrator. He's not the easiest man to deal with." I tried to keep my tone even. "Mr. Hall has handled the family finances for decades. He's careful." "Careful is one thing," she said, swirling her wine. "But it feels restrictive, don't you think? We've been trying to expand some projects and he keeps quoting these spending limits. It's almost as if he doesn't trust us." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's just policy, Sophie." "Policy?" She laughed softly. "It's our money, Ethan. Why do we need policies?" I folded my napkin in my lap, buying myself a second before responding. "Michael set those limits for a reason," I said gently. "He wanted the trust to last, to provide stability, not luxury. It was his way of making sure we never forgot where we came from." Sophie tilted her head, her expression polite but sharp. "And where exactly do you think we came from, Elaine?" I looked at her, unsure if it was a real question or a challenge. "Hard work," I said finally. "Sacrifice, the kind that makes everything you have mean something." She smiled then, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I see." Ethan, ever the peacemaker, quickly changed the subject. He told a story from work, something about a difficult client, and we all laughed again. But that moment lingered, an invisible crack beneath the surface of an otherwise perfect afternoon. After dessert, we moved to the living room. Sophie lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone, showing Ethan pictures of a new designer bag she'd ordered. "It's limited edition," she said. "You can't even find it in stores anymore. I had to get it through a private buyer in Milan." Ethan nodded absently, half listening, half reading messages on his own phone. I sat in my armchair, sipping tea, watching them through the haze of steam. They looked beautiful together, young, confident, so certain that life would always bend to their will. Part of me was proud, seeing the man Ethan had become. The other part ached quietly, knowing how far that man stood from the boy who once scraped his knees running home to show me a frog he'd found by the creek. Sophie looked up suddenly. "Oh, before I forget, Ethan, did you talk to the bank about lifting that temporary freeze Mr. Hall mentioned?" Ethan frowned. "He said he'd review it after the audit. It's standard procedure." She rolled her eyes. "It's humiliating. I tried using the card at Bloomingdale's last week and it got declined. Everyone stared. I felt like a thief." I set my teacup down. "It must have been embarrassing," I said softly. Her gaze flicked to me again, quick, measuring. "Yes, it was. I just wish certain restrictions weren't in place. It's not like we're irresponsible." The room went still. I didn't respond. Ethan filled the silence by checking his watch. "We should get going soon," he said. They left with hugs that felt rehearsed. "Thanks for the meal, Mom," Ethan said, kissing my forehead. "You're the best." Sophie smiled again. "We'll have you over soon, Elaine. I'm redecorating the guest room. You'll love it." When the door closed, I stood there a long moment, listening to the sound of their car fatting down the street. Everything looked perfect, the table cleared, the kitchen gleaming, the air still scented with pie and rosemary, but I felt something hollow in my chest. I went to the window, the same one I used to watch Michael through as he raked leaves in the yard, and let the afternoon light wash over me. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own thoughts too clearly. I remembered something Michael once said after his company's first profitable year. We were sitting on that very porch, his hand over mine, the stars just coming out. "Promise me something, Elaine," he'd said. "Never let generosity turn into obligation. It's a thin line and it's easy to miss until you're on the wrong side of it." At the time, I'd nodded, not fully understanding. Now, standing alone in that spotless kitchen, I felt those words echo like a whisper from the past, a warning that had waited years to be heard. I didn't know it then, but that peaceful Sunday afternoon wasn't a bridge toward healing. It was the calm before the storm, the last time laughter would sound effortless in this house. Because just a few days later, Sophie's call would come, angry, entitled, and loud enough to shatter everything we once called love. The days after that Sunday dinner passed quietly, almost deceptively so. The kind of quiet that makes you think the storm has already moved on when really it's still circling above you waiting. I busied myself with small things, watering the garden, returning library books, baking bread I barely ate. It wasn't until midweek that the silence broke, and it broke like glass. The phone rang again, Sophie's number flashing across the screen. I hesitated before answering, half expecting another complaint about some delivery gone wrong, but the moment I pressed the button, her voice exploded through the speaker. "Do you realize what you've done to us?" she shouted, no greeting, no pause. I was in the middle of an event today, a charity luncheon with sponsors, and when I tried to pay the stylist, my card declined. Declined? Do you have any idea how that looks? Like we're broke, like I'm some kind of con artist. I blinked, caught between disbelief and exhaustion. "Sophie, I told you last time I haven't touched your account, maybe the bank." "Oh, don't you dare blame the bank," she snapped. "You've been meddling, you and that lawyer of yours. You think you can control us because of some stupid paperwork your dead husband left behind." That last line made me grip the counter until my knuckles went white. "Please don't speak about Michael that way," I said quietly. She laughed, sharp and cruel. "Oh, relax, everyone knows he just left you the business because he didn't trust Ethan to run it. Guess he was right." Before I could respond, she hung up just like that. The silence after her voice faded was heavier than before. I set the phone down and stared at the kitchen clock. The second hand ticked on, oblivious, mechanical. I wanted to cry, but instead I reached for my checkbook, something practical, grounding, and started flipping through receipts, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw it, an unfamiliar charge, then another, and another, each one tied to the joint account Ethan had once connected for emergencies. 5,000 here, 1,100 there, hotel stays, jewelry stores, a boutique in Paris. I pulled up the online statement, scrolling faster, heart pounding. Over the past 3 months, they'd spent nearly $40,000, most of it on things that had nothing to do with emergencies. There were no groceries, no medical bills, no mortgage payments, just excess. I felt dizzy. I remembered the day Ethan had asked to link the account. His voice had been warm, reassuring. "It's just so we can help out when you need something, Mom. You shouldn't have to handle everything alone." I'd smiled back then, proud of his thoughtfulness. I never imagined he'd use that same account to drain the savings I'd guarded my whole life. I sat at the table, staring at the list of transactions until the words blurred. Then I called the bank, my voice trembling as I asked them to freeze the joint account temporarily just to prevent further unusual activity. The representative was polite, professional. "Of course, Mrs. Parker, will place a temporary hold while we investigate." I thanked her, hung up, and leaned back in my chair, exhausted. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that Ethan didn't know what Sophie was doing, but a small, stubborn voice inside me whispered that he did. That evening, I made soup but couldn't eat it. The house felt colder than usual, as though the air itself had changed allegiance. By the time the doorbell rang loud, impatient, I already knew who it was. "Ethan." He didn't even wait for me to invite him in. "What the hell, Mom?" he demanded, stepping inside, his eyes blazing with the same fury I'd seen in him as a teenager. "You froze the account." I steadied myself. "I didn't freeze it, Ethan, the bank." "Don't," he interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. "Don't lie to me. Sophie told me you did it after that phone call. You had no right." "I had every right," I said quietly. "That money wasn't for shopping sprees and overseas flights, it was for family needs, real ones." He scoffed, packing the kitchen. "You think you can decide what our needs are? We're adults, Mom. You don't get to control us like we're still kids." "I never tried to control you," I said. "I just wanted to protect what your father worked for." He turned to face me then, eyes narrowing. "Protect from who? From me?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. His words stung, not because they were loud, but because they carried something colder, belief. He genuinely thought I didn't trust him. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this has been for us?" he continued. "Sophie was at a public event today, Mom. People saw, they laughed. She posted about it online because she had to explain herself." I frowned. "Posted what?" He thrust his phone at me. There on the screen was Sophie's social media story, a photo of her half crying, half pouting in a luxury boutique mirror, captioned, "When your husband's family cuts you off to teach you lessons." Humiliation, family drama. Hundreds of comments below, sympathy, gossip, some people even mentioning my name, asking who I was. My heart sank as I scrolled through the strangers' opinions about a woman they didn't know, a stingy old mother-in-law, a control freak, a bitter widow. "Ethan," I said softly, setting the phone down, "you let her post this." "She was upset," he snapped. "What did you expect her to do? Everyone saw her card get declined." "What I expected," I said, my voice trembling but firm, "was for you to call me before assuming the worst." He crossed his arms. "You're always the victim, aren't you? Always the martyr. You think you're the only one who's sacrificed." That word sacrifice hit something deep in me. I'd given him my youth, my energy, my security. And yet here he was, standing in the same kitchen where I once measured his height against the wall, accusing me of selfishness. He took a breath, then delivered the blow that would echo for days. "You wouldn't have anything without Dad's company anyway." I froze. For a second, I wasn't even sure I'd heard him right. The words felt like a slap I hadn't prepared for. "Ethan," I whispered, "don't say that." "Why not? It's true. You didn't build it. You just inherited it." I looked at him, really looked at the face I'd loved since the moment I first held him. The freckles across his nose, the line of his jaw so much like his father's. But I couldn't find Michael's warmth there anymore, just coldness. Something inside me broke then, not loudly but deeply, like a quiet thread snapping in the dark. I didn't argue, I didn't shout, I just stood there letting the weight of it sink in. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd believed would honor his father's legacy, was now talking to me like a stranger fighting over inheritance. He kept going, his voice rising and falling in waves of frustration. "You've been holding that trust over us for years. You decide what's appropriate, you decide when we can spend, and then you act like you're being generous. It's manipulation, Mom, that's what it is." "Ethan, stop," I said softly, but he didn't. "No," he said, slamming his hand against the counter. "You think you're better than us because you live modestly. Well, congratulations, you win the moral trophy, but don't pretend it gives you the right to humiliate us." I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I never wanted to humiliate you, Ethan. I just wanted to protect you from making mistakes you regret later." He shook his head, eyes glistening. "You don't get it, you never did." Then he walked out again, leaving the door half open behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space he'd left, the faint smell of his cologne still lingering. Outside, the evening had turned gray, the kind of color that makes everything feel faded. I thought about calling him back, explaining everything, how the freeze was temporary, how it was just the bank doing its job. But I didn't. For the first time in my life, I didn't chase after him. Instead, I sat down, folded my hands on the table, and whispered the words I'd kept hidden for years. "Michael, I wish you were here. I don't know how to fix this." The clock ticked on. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked. I felt small in my own house, surrounded by silence and betrayal. I didn't realize it yet, but that night marked the end of the version of motherhood I'd always known, the kind that believed love alone could keep a family together. Because love, it turned out, could be twisted into leverage. In the next morning, I would learn just how far that leverage had already gone. I couldn't sleep after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, Ethan's words replayed like an echo I couldn't silence. "You wouldn't have anything without Dad's company anyway." They didn't just sting, they hollowed something out inside me. But no matter how deep the wound, a mother's instinct always whispers the same foolish thing: fix it. So, 2 mornings later, I packed a bag of groceries and drove to their house. I told myself it was just to drop off a few things: Ethan's favorite soup, a loaf of bread, and some fresh fruit, peace offerings disguised as kindness. The drive was short but heavy, every streetlight another reminder that I might not be welcome. Their neighborhood looked more like a movie set than a place where real people lived. Manicured lawns, imported cars, facades that gleamed too perfectly in the sun. I parked by the curb and stared at their house, all glass and stone and expensive silence. I'd helped with the down payment years ago. I remembered signing that check, thinking I was investing in my son's happiness. I walked up the front steps, balancing the grocery bag against my hip, and rang the doorbell. No one answered. I hesitated, then tried the handle unlocked. "Hello," I called softly, stepping inside. The house smelled faintly of jasmine and citrus cleaner. My voice echoed through the marble foyer. "Ethan, Sophie." Still no answer. I took a few steps toward the kitchen and froze when I heard voices, not coming from inside but through the open patio doors at the back. I moved quietly, not to spy but because something in their tone made my heart beat faster. Sophie's voice floated in, light and sharp as glass. "She still thinks she owns the house," she said with a little laugh. "Can you believe that? She dropped off paperwork last month like she's still the one in charge." "She's just trying to help," Ethan murmured, his voice low, uncertain. "Help?" Sophie snorted. "By freezing accounts and embarrassing us publicly, by making me look like a gold digger to my followers. Don't kid yourself, Ethan. Your mother's holding onto that trust like it's her throne, and you're letting her." There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the rustle of fabric, maybe her hand on his arm. "She's not a bad person," he said weakly. "She's manipulative," Sophie countered. "And you're too blind to see it. You're a grown man, Ethan. Don't you think it's time you stopped asking permission to live your life?" I stood in the shadow of the doorway, every muscle tense. I should have walked away, I knew that, but something in me couldn't move. Hearing them talk about me like I was some obstacle instead of the woman who'd raised him toward something vital. "I'm not asking permission," Ethan said after a long silence. "I just don't want to start a war." "Then stop acting like a soldier and start acting like the general," Sophie said, her tone softening into persuasion. "Talk to the lawyer, take over the trust. It's your inheritance, not hers." My breath caught. Ethan didn't reply. The sound of their footsteps faded down the patio stairs, and I slipped quietly back toward the front door, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out thought. I set the groceries on the porch, my hands shaking, and drove home without remembering a single turn of the wheel. That evening, I sat in my living room with all the lights off. The ticking clock sounded louder than usual. I kept waiting for the phone to ring, for Ethan to call and tell me I'd misunderstood, that Sophie had exaggerated, that they weren't really plotting anything. But the phone stayed silent. The next few days passed like walking through fog. I went to the library, shelved books, smiled at patrons, all on autopilot. Inside, my thoughts kept circling back to their conversation. Take over the trust. I couldn't imagine Ethan doing something so cruel. Not him, not my boy who used to slip handmade cards under my bedroom door on Mother's Day. But mothers often mistake silence for goodness. 4 days later, I found out what that silence had been hiding. I was making tea when a courier arrived, envelope in hand. "Mrs. Parker?" he asked. I nodded, signing where he pointed. The envelope was thick, heavy. I didn't open it right away. I waited until he left, then carried it to the table, setting it down like something fragile. The first page was from a law firm in the city, a name I didn't recognize. The second line froze me where I sat. "Notice of intent to amend power of attorney." For several seconds, the words didn't make sense. Then they did. Ethan and Sophie were attempting to transfer financial authority, the power of attorney that governed the family trust, from me to them. My vision blurred. I read the page again, slower this time. There it was in black ink. Ethan Parker and Sophie Parker hereby petition to assume administrative rights of the Parker family trust on the grounds of age-related mismanagement and emotional instability of the current trustee, Mrs. Elaine Parker. I let out a sound I didn't recognize, half laugh, half gasp. Emotional instability. The phrase echoed, ugly and absurd. I hadn't missed a payment or made a mistake in 20 years, yet now my own son was painting me as incapable, a liability. The next pages listed the assets in question, the company shares, the remaining savings, even my house, everything Michael and I had built, everything I'd protected, all of it neatly typed out as items to be transferred. By the time I reached the end, my hands were trembling so badly that I had to set the papers down. I felt sick, not angry yet, that would come later, just hollow. That night I didn't eat, I couldn't. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the envelope. Outside, the streetlights flickered against the blinds, casting bars of shadow across the floor. It reminded me of a cage. I thought of Michael again. He trusted me with this legacy, not because I was smarter, but because I was careful, because I understood that wealth meant responsibility. We built our lives on quiet effort, on knowing the value of what we had. Ethan had grown up in that same house, surrounded by that same humility. And yet somewhere between success and sophistication, he'd forgot. Or maybe Sophie had taught him to forget. I wanted to march to their house, to tear up those papers in front of them, to demand how they could look me in the eye and call me unstable. But I couldn't. Something inside me refused to give Sophie the satisfaction of my fury. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I endured. I folded the papers neatly, slipped them back into the envelope, and placed it in my desk drawer beside the family photo, the one taken years ago when Ethan was still in college, his arms slung over my shoulder, his smile genuine. I stared at that photo for a long time, tracing the edges of his face. How did we get here? I whispered. The next morning, I called Mr. Hall, our longtime lawyer. His voice was calm, as always. Elaine, I was expecting your call, he said. So it's true, I murmured. I'm afraid it is, he replied. They've filed the petition, though it hasn't gone through yet. Don't sign anything, I'll handle it. I thanked him, my voice barely steady. I just don't understand, Richard. How could he do this? He sighed softly. Money changes people, Elaine, but guilt changes them faster. When the call ended, I sat there in silence, letting his words settle. Guilt. Maybe Ethan wasn't evil, maybe he was ashamed, maybe this was his way of running from it. But understanding didn't dull the pain. If anything, it deepened it. That evening, I opened the windows and let the cool air in. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, sharp, lonely, fatting. I thought about Sophie's voice again on that patio. She still thinks she owns the house. She was right about one thing. I did think I owned it because I did. Not just the house, but the memories, the history, the love poured into its walls. And if they wanted to take that from me, they'd have to face something they'd forgotten existed. Not just a mother. A woman who had finally stopped being afraid to lose her own child. And somewhere deep in that realization, the first ember of resolve began to glow. The next morning, I dressed carefully, not because I cared how I looked, but because I needed to feel composed. Grief has a way of showing through the smallest cracks, and I couldn't afford that today. I pressed my gray coat, fixed my pearl earrings, and told myself I was going to have a conversation, not a confrontation. Mr. Hall's office sat above the post office in the oldest brick building in town. I'd been there dozens of times over the years, but that morning it felt different, heavier, almost sacred. The brass letters on the door read Hall & Associates, though I'd always thought Associates was just a courtesy. Richard Hall had never needed anyone else. He was calm in the way that made you trust him, the kind of man who'd seen every flavor of human greed and still believed in decency. He rose when I entered. Elaine, he said warmly, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. You look tired. I am, I admitted, sitting down. I received the papers. His expression darkened, the faint smile fading. I know, I was copied on the filing. I've already prepared a response, but before we proceed, there are a few things you need to understand. He opened a thick folder, flipping through pages covered in tabs and sticky notes. The sound of the paper crackling filled the quiet room. First, he said, looking up, I want you to stop blaming yourself. None of this is your fault. I just don't understand, I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. How could Ethan think I'd take something from him? Everything I've done was for him. Richard sighed. I've seen it more times than I'd like to admit. When people marry into wealth, especially those who didn't grow up managing it, they often confuse access with ownership. Sophie seems to have convinced Ethan that the trust was a barrier between him and what he deserves. I swallowed hard, and now they're trying to take it. He gave a small, knowing smile. Trying, he repeated, that's the key word. He pulled another folder from his drawer and placed it between us. There's something you should know, something Michael and I discussed years ago when he set up your estate planning. I never told you before because he asked me not to unless it became necessary. I frowned. Necessary. He nodded. Michael anticipated this, Elaine, not the specifics perhaps, but the possibility of manipulation of someone trying to use Ethan's love against him. So when he created the trust, he did something unusual. He turned the folder toward me and pointed to the first page, Parker Manufacturing Company, ownership record. Michael's shares, the majority stake in the company, were never placed into the family trust. They were transferred directly to you in your name, independent of any joint accounts. You are the sole legal owner. For a moment, I just stared at the paper, the words blurred. What do you mean? I mean, Richard said gently, that the company and its accumulated value has nothing to do with the trust your son and daughter-in-law are fighting over. The trust contains only residual funds, savings, investments, the house. The real wealth, Elaine, has always been under your sole control. My mouth went dry. So even if they took the trust, they'd gain access to a fraction of your estate, maybe 10%, nothing more. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall behind him. The painting of a lighthouse one eye looked at 100 times before seemed suddenly symbolic, a single beam cutting through fog. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without shaking. Michael, I whispered, you clever man. Richard smiled softly. He was very deliberate. He told me once, Elaine is steady, she'll never use money to punish, but if someone tries to use it to punish her, I want her protected. A laugh escaped me then, half tear, half relief. He knew me better than I knew myself. He did, Richard said, and he knew Ethan's weakness too, his need to please, to prove himself. That's why he put those safeguards in place, not to trap your son, but to save him from being manipulated. I nodded slowly, the reality sinking in. So the account Sophie claimed I blocked. Richard opened another document, a fraud alert. The bank flagged suspicious charges, international vendors, duplicate authorizations, and one particularly large payment attempt for luxury furniture. The system automatically froze the card. It wasn't you at all. I let out a long breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Richard continued, his tone kind but firm. I've also reviewed Sophie's online activity. She's tied to several business accounts under her name, influencer deals, affiliate promotions, and she's been using the trust card to fund those ventures. That's likely what triggered the alert. I closed my eyes for a moment, overwhelmed not by anger but by something quieter, vindication laced with sadness. All this time I'd been cast as the villain in a story Sophie had written, and my own son had believed it. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady again. What should I do, Richard? Nothing, he said simply. At least not yet. Let me handle the legal response. I'll send notice that their petition is invalid due to incomplete disclosure and conflict of interest. That will stall their filing indefinitely. You, meanwhile, need to decide what kind of justice you want. I frowned. Justice? He nodded. You could cut them off entirely, transfer assets, revoke access, even press charges for financial misuse, but I don't think that's what you want. He was right. Even in my anger, I couldn't bring myself to destroy Ethan. He was still my son, still the child who once slipped dandelions into my hair, but I also knew I couldn't let things continue as they were. I don't want revenge, I said slowly. I want truth. Richard smiled faintly. Then let's give it to them in your way. He slid a sealed envelope toward me. Inside is the original ownership deed and Michael's recorded statement. He left it as part of a contingency clause in case questions of ownership ever arose. I hesitated before taking it. A statement. A short video, Richard said. He recorded it just before his last surgery. I've never shown it to anyone, not even Ethan. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Why tell me now? Because it's time, Richard said simply. You've spent too long defending your integrity to people who stopped listening. Maybe it's time to let Michael speak for you. I left the office with that envelope pressed to my chest. The wind outside was brisk, the kind that wakes you up after a long sleep. For months, maybe years, I'd been shrinking, apologizing, explaining, hoping kindness would fix entitlement. But as I walked down those steps, something shifted inside me. Not rage, not pride, just clarity. By the time I reached my car, the plan was already forming. I wouldn't call Ethan. I wouldn't argue or plead. I would let him and Sophie see the truth the same way they'd seen the lie publicly. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and whispered to the empty car, "You taught me patience, Michael. Now watch what I do with it." The road ahead shimmered in the midday sun, and for the first time in a long while I felt steady, not because I'd won, but because I finally remembered who I was. And this time, I wouldn't be the one on trial. I spent the next few days in absolute stillness, not the defeated kind, but the focused kind, like the air right before thunder. I kept my routine normal, library shifts, morning walks, grocery runs. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, every move was deliberate. I was preparing for something I hadn't done in years, to take control without shouting, to win without a single cruel word. By Thursday, I'd made my decision. I called Ethan. "Dinner this Sunday," I said, keeping my tone warm but calm. "Just the three of us. I'd like to talk things through before the lawyers get involved." There was a pause on the line, the kind that carries unspoken calculation. Then Ethan sighed. "Fine, but Sophie wants to bring her attorney." "That won't be necessary," I interrupted gently. "Mr. Hall will be present to make sure everything stays clear and civil, that's all." He hesitated again, then muttered, "Okay, Mom, Sunday." When I hung up, I looked around my house, the one Sophie had once said I still thought I owned. The walls were lined with pictures of a life she'd never understand. A younger me holding a newborn Ethan, Michael in his workshop, sleeves rolled up, eyes kind. I traced my fingers across one frame and whispered, "Let's finish what we started." Sunday came like a calm sea hiding an undertow. I set the table the way I used to when Michael hosted company dinners, simple, elegant, no extravagance, just care. Roast chicken, vegetables, and a bottle of red wine I'd been saving for years. The smell of rosemary filled the air again, and for a fleeting second I remembered the Sunday dinners that used to end in laughter, not silence. At 6 sharp the doorbell rang. Ethan walked in first, tense, his jaw set. Sophie followed in a fitted blazer, her phone in hand like a weapon. She smiled tightly. "Lovely as always, Elaine, you really do like your modest settings." "Some things don't need upgrading," I said, smiling politely. "Come in." Mr. Hall was already seated in the living room, a quiet presence beside his briefcase. Sophie noticed him immediately. "Oh, this is going to be formal, isn't it?" she said with a small laugh. "Just fair," I replied. We sat down at the table. For a few minutes, conversation pretended to exist, Ethan commenting on the meal, Sophie scrolling under the table. Then I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. "I think we should begin," I said. Ethan straightened. "Mom, if this is about the petition." "It is," I said softly, "and a few other things." I reached for the envelope I'd placed on the sideboard and opened it carefully. "First, I want to address the accusation that I froze your accounts. I didn't. The bank did automatically because of multiple flagged transactions." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "That's not true, we checked." I slid a printed statement across the table. "It is. There were charges made through international vendors and duplicate authorizations linked to your business accounts, Sophie. The fraud team confirmed it, triggered an alert. You'll find their report on page 3. Her hand hovered above the papers but didn't touch them. Mr. Hall cleared his throat. "The documentation has been verified. I spoke directly to the bank's compliance officer myself." Ethan's expression shifted from defiance to confusion. "Wait, so you did?" "No," I said quietly, "I didn't." For a brief moment, silence blanketed the table. Sophie looked away, pretending to check her phone. Ethan rubbed his temples. I continued, my tone calm, almost motherly. "Next, I want to talk about the family trust, the one you both believe gives you ownership over my finances." I reached into my folder again, pulling out the second set of documents. "Michael and I structured that trust for security, not power, but there's something you never understood about it." I slid another paper across to Ethan. "The trust covers household assets, savings, and investments. What it doesn't include," I said, pausing for just a beat, "is Parker Manufacturing." Sophie's head snapped up. "What?" "The company," I said evenly. "The one your father built from the ground up and that you've both been counting on inheriting one day. It was never part of the trust. Michael transferred his shares directly to me before he passed. They've always been under my sole ownership." Ethan blinked. "That can't be right," Dad said. "Your father said a lot of things meant to teach you, Ethan," I interrupted softly. "You just stopped listening." He glanced at Mr. Hall, desperate for contradiction, but Richard nodded. "It's true. The company belongs entirely to your mother, legally and irrevocably." Sophie's composure cracked. "That's absurd. He wouldn't do that. He wanted the company to stay in the family." "It is in the family," I said. "I'm the family." For the first time all evening, she had no retort. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that stretches across generations. Ethan's eyes darted between us, his breathing quickening. "So what happens now? You just keep everything?" I looked at him gently. "I keep what's mine, Ethan, what your father entrusted me to protect, but that's not all he left." I stood and walked toward the small cabinet by the wall, retrieving a laptop already connected to the television. The screen flickered on, displaying a paused video file titled "For My Family." Sophie rolled her eyes. "What is this, a production?" "It's a message," I said, pressing play. The image of Michael appeared, older, thinner, sitting in his office. His voice was calm, the same even tone he used when teaching Ethan how to fix a bike chain. "If you're seeing this," he began, "it means your mother had to remind you who built your life." Ethan's face went pale. Michael continued, his gaze steady. "I know how easy it is to forget the foundation you stand on. I've watched men lose themselves to pride, believing inheritance is a birthright instead of a gift. But Elaine understands something you don't. That wealth means nothing if it costs you respect. She's the steward of what I built, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it every single day." He paused, his smile faint but knowing. "Son, if you're angry right now, good. That means you care, but don't let anyone, not your pride, not your spouse, not the world, make you mistake love for control. Your mother's love is the reason any of this exists. Remember that." The video ended, the screen went black, but the silence stayed. I turned to face them. Ethan's eyes glistened, wide and wet. Sophie sat rigid, her fingers clenched around her phone, her face draining of color. "Well," she said finally, her voice brittle, "that was touching." She stood abruptly, snatching her purse. "I think this conversation is over." "Sophie," Ethan began, but she was already walking toward the door. "I'll wait in the car," she said without looking back. "You two clearly have history to relive." The door slammed behind her, leaving only the sound of the clock ticking. Ethan stayed seated, staring at the empty chair across from him. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear, Mom, I didn't know she filed those papers. She told me it was just a formality, that it would make things easier for you." I sat beside him, my anger long gone, replaced by something gentler but firmer. "You didn't read what you were signing, did you?" He shook his head slowly. "Then it's time you start reading, Ethan, not just documents, people." He covered his face with his hands. When he finally looked up, the boy I once knew flickered there for just a moment. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought you were trying to control us. I didn't realize." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You wanted to be trusted and I wanted to protect you. Somewhere in the middle, we both lost sight of love." He nodded, tears spilling over. "What happens now?" "Now," I said softly, "we rebuild, but on truth, not guilt." Mr. Hall closed his briefcase quietly, his tone measured. "I'll file the withdrawal of petition tomorrow morning. The rest, I'll leave to the two of you." Ethan squeezed my hand, his grip trembling. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I almost did," I admitted, "but your father didn't." He managed a small, shaky smile. "He always believed in you." The night ended not with laughter, but with quiet, the kind that feels clean, like rain washing away dust. When Ethan left, he hugged me longer than he had in years. Outside, his car idled for a moment before driving off. I watched the taillights fade into the dark, the sound of the engine fading too, leaving only stillness behind. Then I looked at the laptop screen one last time, Michael's frozen image smiling faintly, his eyes meeting mine across the years. "I did it, love," I whispered, without raising my voice. And for the first time in months, I slept through the night. The house was quiet again, peacefully, naturally quiet this time. No tension humming beneath the walls, no footsteps packing with anger. Just the rhythm of ordinary days returning, the way morning light fell across the floorboards, and the soft tick of the hallway clock that had measured my life for 40 years. It had been 3 weeks since that dinner, the longest, hardest, and strangely most liberating night of my life. The days afterward unfolded gently, like a wound slowly closing. I spent my mornings in the garden, trimming the lavender, mending small things that had waited too long, a loose hinge, a chipped teacup, a shelf that had leaned for years. Each repair felt symbolic, as if I were putting pieces of myself back where they belonged. The town moved on, as towns do. The gossip about the Parker family drama faded as quickly as it had flared. Mr. Hall handled everything quietly. He withdrew Ethan's petition, secured the trust, and closed the accounts that had once been shared. When the bank called to confirm the final signatures, the woman on the line said, "You're now the sole administrator again, Mrs. Parker." Her voice carried respect, not pity, and it made me smile. Ethan didn't call right away. I didn't expect him to. Pride takes time to untangle, and shame even longer, but I thought about him often. I'd catch myself setting out 2 mugs in the morning, one for me, one for him, then quietly putting one back. Some habits, like hope, die slowly. It was a Thursday afternoon when the phone finally rang. His number flashed on the screen, and for a moment I just stared at it, unsure whether to answer. Then I did. "Mom," he said softly, and that single word carried 1,000 unsaid things: regret, exhaustion, love. "Hello, Ethan," I said, keeping my tone calm. There was silence on the other end, the kind that trembles with apology before it finds words. "I didn't know how to call you," he said at last. "I wasn't sure if you'd even want to hear from me." "I was waiting," I said, "but I needed you to call for the right reason." He took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything, for the things I said, for believing her, for not protecting you. You didn't deserve that." I closed my eyes, letting his words settle like rain on dry ground. "No, Ethan," I said gently, "but I understand why it happened. You were trying to build a life. You just forgot you already had one worth keeping." He exhaled shakily. "Sophie, she filed for divorce." "I know," I said softly. "Mr. Hall mentioned it." She said we have different values, he continued, bitterness creeping into his voice. I guess that's her polite way of saying she found someone wealthier. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. But maybe that's a blessing in disguise. Sometimes losing someone is the only way to see how little they respected what they had. He was quiet for a long time. I don't know how to fix this, Mom, between us. You don't need to fix it, I said. You just need to honor it. What do you mean? I mean that love doesn't erase boundaries, it respects them. You're my son, Ethan, and I'll always love you. But we can't go back to shared accounts, joint decisions, or blurred lines. You have your life, I have mine, and maybe that's how it should be. He swallowed hard. You're right, I don't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, I said softly. It's about peace. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic behind him, horns, footsteps, life moving on. Do you think Dad would forgive me? He asked quietly. I smiled through the ache in my throat. He already did. He was always one step ahead of both of us. Ethan laughed weakly, the sound fragile but real. You sound like him. I learned from the best, I said. When the call ended, I sat for a while with the phone still in my hand, not crying, not relieved, just still. That was new for me, stillness without fear. Days passed. I returned to my volunteer work at the library, helping children find books, organizing the community reading hour. People greeted me with kindness, the kind that says, we saw what you went through and we admire how you carried it. I didn't need their admiration, but I appreciated their quiet respect. Every so often, Ethan visited. The first time he brought a small box of lemon pastries, the kind his father used to love. Thought we could start over, he said shyly. We had tea on the porch. He didn't bring up Sophie and I didn't ask. We talked about ordinary things, his job, the weather, the garden. There was a gentleness between us now, fragile but growing. I noticed, too, that he looked different, less polished, more human. The weight of pride had lifted from his shoulders. He even laughed once, really laughed, and for a second I saw the boy who used to run barefoot across the lawn chasing fireflies. That was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, I found myself rewatching Michael's video. I'd kept it saved on my laptop, though I hadn't opened it since that dinner. His voice filled the room again, warm and sure. If you're seeing this, it means your mother had to remind you who built your life. But this time, I didn't feel the sting of sadness. I just felt gratitude for a man who had seen the future so clearly, for a son who had finally learned the hardest lesson of all, and for myself for surviving without bitterness. I closed the laptop, stood by the window, and watched the street outside. The lamplight shimmered across the pavement, the world moving as it always does. For the first time in months, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything, not an apology, not a phone call, not validation. My life had found its balance again, quieter but stronger. People often think power means control, but I'd learned something different. Power can be silence, the kind that doesn't demand to be heard but still changes everything. The silence that comes after truth, when you no longer need to prove who you are. I thought of that night at the dinner table, the way Sophie had left in a storm of embarrassment, the way Ethan's voice had cracked under the weight of realization. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't cursed. I'd simply spoken the truth, and that truth had done what anger never could. It restored my dignity. As the evening settled, I made a pot of tea and sat on the porch, listening to the crickets begin their song. The air smelled of earth and rosemary. Across the yard, the wind stirred the chimes Michael had hung the year before he passed. Their soft notes drifted toward me, tender and familiar. I smiled to myself, feeling something I hadn't in a long while, not victory, not pride, but peace, pure and quiet peace. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was what Michael had wanted all along, not for me to win, but to remember that love, when coupled with patience, could outlast any betrayal. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the loudest justice there is. A few months later, the world felt lighter, not because everything had gone back to how it used to be. Life never rewinds, but because peace had finally taken root where pain once lived. I could breathe again without guilt or worry pressing against my chest. Ethan and I spoke regularly now, not every day, but enough. He started volunteering with a mentorship program for young engineers, helping students who couldn't afford college. Dad would have liked this, he told me once, smiling shyly. I nodded, my heart swelling. Maybe redemption didn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it came quietly in the shape of small, consistent kindnesses. Sophie had moved out of state. I never asked where. I only wished her peace because anger felt too heavy to carry anymore. The court finalized their divorce swiftly, and Ethan told me later that she'd taken almost nothing with her. She said it all reminded her of what she lost, he confessed. I didn't answer. Some lessons life delivers without words. One morning, as I was sorting through paperwork in Michael's old desk, I came across a folder labeled Legacy Fund. It was something he'd drafted years ago, a modest idea for a scholarship to help local students attend trade school. Not everyone needs college, he used to say. Some just need someone to believe in their hands. I sat there staring at that folder for a long time, running my fingers along his handwriting. It felt like an invitation, a final nudge from him to turn what we'd built into something that outlived our mistakes. That afternoon, I called Mr. Hall. Richard, I said, I want to establish the Parker Scholarship. Use part of my company shares to fund it quietly, no press, no plaques, just opportunity. He paused. You're sure? Yes, I said, smiling. I've spent too long watching wealth divide. Maybe it's time it healed. Within weeks, the paperwork was done. The first scholarship recipient was a young woman named Clara, a single mother studying mechanical design. When she came to thank me, she said something that caught in my throat. I promise I won't waste this. Someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I could only nod because I knew exactly what that felt like. That evening, I walked through the company's old factory, now converted into an educational workshop. Machines hummed softly, the smell of oil and dust mixing with something hopeful. I could almost see Michael there, sleeves rolled up, his patient smile guiding another generation toward something honest. It was in that moment I realized the full circle of it all. Money had never been the enemy, it was how we handled love that decided whether it built or destroyed. Michael had left me tools, not treasures, and for a while I'd forgotten how to use them. But now, standing amid those machines, I remembered. Later, back home, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window as twilight faded to blue. The town looked the same as ever, children's laughter from down the street, someone mowing their lawn, the scent of rain in the air, ordinary life, steady and faithful. I thought of Ethan again, his tears, his apology, his determination to start fresh, and I felt no resentment, only gratitude. We had survived something that could have broken us completely. Love had bruised us, but it hadn't failed us. It had just needed boundaries to stand on. That night, as I folded away the scholarship papers, I found myself whispering words I hadn't planned. I raised a man, not a bank account. Saying them out loud felt like a closing prayer, an acknowledgement that motherhood wasn't about giving endlessly, but about teaching the difference between receiving and taking. I realized, too, that part of my journey wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about reclaiming self-respect. Somewhere between love and obligation, I'd forgotten that boundaries weren't walls, they were doors that opened to healthier rooms. And I suppose that's what I'd tell anyone listening now. If you give everything without pause, people forget it's a gift. If you never say no, they stop hearing yes. Love without limits eventually teaches others that you can be bought, but respect is earned in the quiet moments when you stand firm, even when it hurts. Michael used to say, the world tests the gentle people the hardest. I used to think he meant it as a warning. Now I see it was a blessing, because gentleness isn't weakness, it's endurance wrapped in grace. It's the strength to walk away from chaos and still wish it peace. I watched the last light fade beyond the horizon and felt something inside me settle. The noise of betrayal had finally gone quiet, replaced by the soft hum of purpose. I didn't need validation anymore. I had lived through loss, disappointment, and misunderstanding, and somehow found meaning in all of it. Before going to bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, the stars faint but steady. The wind moved through the chimes again, singing their soft metallic hymn. I closed my eyes and smiled. I think we did all right, Michael, I whispered. It took a while, but I think we finally got it right. Somewhere in the stillness, I felt an answer, not in words, but in warmth, the way memory sometimes feels like presence. I took a deep breath and turned off the porch light. Tomorrow would come, simple and steady, and I would greet it not as someone waiting to be understood, but as someone who already was. Because in the end, the lesson was simple. Love needs boundaries. Respect needs courage. And silence, when chosen, not forced, can be the most powerful voice of all. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. I know this story wasn't easy to hear. It wasn't easy to live either. But maybe that's why I told it to remind someone out there that love, even the truest kind, isn't meant to erase your worth. You see, I spent most of my life believing that patience could fix anything, that if I just stayed gentle enough, quiet enough, forgiving enough, people would see the goodness in my intentions. But love without boundaries doesn't heal, it erases. It teaches others that your heart is a resource, not a home. If your love has ever been mistaken for weakness, remember it's never too late to teach respect. It doesn't matter if you're 70 or 17, whether it's your child, your spouse, or a friend you've carried too long, you're allowed to set the plate down and rest. There's this moment that comes after every storm when you look around and realize the world hasn't ended, it's just cleaner. That's how it felt for me after everything was over. Softer, lighter, as if the air itself understood that truth had done its work. People often ask, would you take him back if he hurt you again? The truth is, love doesn't mean forgetting what happened, it means choosing what to do with it. I chose not to hold Ethan's mistakes like weapons, but as lessons, not just for him, for me too. I had to learn that forgiveness doesn't mean re-entry, it can simply mean peace. A quiet, I wish you well, instead of a loud, I told you so. Because peace is a kind of victory too, the kind that doesn't need applause. Sometimes I think about all the parents, especially mothers, sitting in kitchens like mine right now, hands folded, hearts heavy, wondering if they were too strict or too kind or too naive. And I want to tell them, you did your best, you loved the way you knew how. Don't let anyone make you feel small for giving your heart honestly. But also don't let anyone make you feel guilty for finally saying, enough. There's strength in silence, the kind that doesn't slam doors or break things but simply stands still until the noise around it burns itself out. That's what I learned. That's what Michael's wisdom left behind. So tonight, wherever you are, if you're listening to this with a lump in your throat, if you've ever been the one holding a family together while everyone else pulled it apart, please hear this. You are not weak. You are not unlovable. You are simply human, and your love still matters. I used to believe my worth depended on how well I could hold people close. Now I know it's also measured by how gracefully I can let them go. Ethan and I are still rebuilding. Slowly, tenderly. There are phone calls that end in silence and dinners where we talk more about weather than wounds. But there's love again, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't demand proof. Maybe that's enough. Sometimes when I pass by the old family photographs on the wall, I stop at the one where he's still a boy, freckles, gap-toothed smile, arms around my neck. I remind myself that motherhood doesn't end with disappointment. It just changes shape. It becomes a kind of faith that the lessons we planted will bloom someday, even if it takes years. And when doubt creeps in, I think of that last dinner, the moment truth filled the room like sunlight. Sophie's voice trembling, Ethan's face softening, the silence afterward that didn't feel empty anymore, it felt sacred. That was the day I learned that sometimes you don't have to fight for respect, you just have to stop surrendering it. So let me ask you something, since you've listened to my story. Would you forgive your child if they treated you this way? Would you let them back in, or would you walk away to save what's left of your heart? I don't have the right answer. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe forgiveness isn't a straight line, it's a circle that brings you back to yourself first. What I do know is this: it's never too late to remember who you are, to choose dignity over duty, calm over chaos, truth over approval. Those choices don't make you cruel, they make you whole. So, if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of your own strength or made you see love a little differently, tell me in the comments. Tell me your story. Tell me what you've forgiven or what you're still learning to release. Because every voice, every lesson, every quiet act of courage, those are the stories that heal the rest of us. And if tonight you close your eyes and feel a little more at peace than yesterday, then maybe that's where our stories meet. Thank you for listening.